When the COVID-19 pandemic hit in early 2020, it was such a massive disruption on so many levels that I just don't think, as a society, that we've really processed what it all means. Just in terms of transportation, the streets emptied out, traffic volumes plunged, lots of cities closed streets to vehicular traffic to create open space for people to walk and bike, or repurposed street parking to create more space for outdoor seating. It felt like maybe the pandemic had a silver lining and we were all going to get a lot smarter about how we use public space and how we get around the city. Well, fast forward 5 years in, it seems like traffic is worse than ever. So today I want to spend some time trying to answer the question, what happened? And my search for answers leads to a lot of interesting data and research, and this is a case where all roads seem to lead to New York City. First of all, I love internet search engines, but they're practically useless for answering questions like this. Most likely, you'll end up on Reddit reading a whole bunch of unfounded theories written as if they're incontrovertible truth by the kinds of people who post on Reddit. And I sort of get it. This is a tough topic to research. Understanding why people choose to make the trips they do, why they choose to drive a car, or why they own a car at all, go to deep questions of human psychology that are hard to quantify, but today I'm gonna give it my best shot. First, let's all get on the same page, and the reason I'm making the video is this. A report called The State of Vehicle Miles Traveled and Congestion from the big data firm Streetlight. Streetlight aggregates data from sources like GPS and location services and makes it available in a proprietary tool that lets you analyze things like travel patterns and origin destination. Full disclosure, when I was doing consulting, I was a bit of a Streetlight power user, but as a YouTuber, I just cannot afford the licensing fee. Their clients are really public agencies and consulting firms, which makes the narrative in this report all the more interesting. You expect straightforward data and analysis from a firm like this, and the charts showing VMT per capita trending up year by year since the initial stay-at-home orders in 2020 to the point where it's now higher than it was pre-pandemic says a lot. But the narrative that goes with it is worth lingering on a bit. Stay-at-home orders resulted in an abrupt and dramatic decline in VMT. While this reversal corresponded with pandemic trauma, it also created a different vision of what our cities could be with less noise, more open space, and cleaner air. This is not editorializing you expect from a firm that does a lot of business with state DOTs. And there's more. While there was some hope that a new remote work culture might keep miles driven down and congestion at bay, Streetlight's results indicate that the status quo isn't working. A reliance on remote work is not a panacea to the rise in VMT, and the default solution for traffic, adding roadway capacity, isn't solving congestion. I cannot emphasize strongly enough that this is not normal language that you would ever see in a report from a vendor whose bottom line depends on selling data and services to state highway departments. This kind of language sets off all kinds of alarms for me, and it's really why I had to make this video. So it's a really interesting report, and I do encourage people to take a look, and I did leave a link down in the description. But it doesn't get to the question that I really wanted an answer to, which is why? Why, if there are more people working from home than ever, is traffic worse than ever? To try to answer this question, I'm going to start by inflicting the Texas Transportation Institute's 2023 Urban Mobility Report on you. The Urban Mobility Report comes out of Texas A&M and has been published since 1987. And I'm not going to get into critiques about how it measures and frames issues around congestion, but this is definitely a deep rabbit hole you can go down if you're interested. This 2023 edition has a lot of the same findings as the Streetlight report, but it attempts a little more diagnosis. For example, the evolving impacts on public transportation and increased work schedule flexibility have resulted in more traffic during midday periods and more non-transit traffic on the road in general. Which doesn't seem intuitive, but I am going to get into some peer-reviewed research that sheds more light on this later in the video. Also, the shift is evident in the rising sales of automobiles as people seem to seek greater flexibility, control, and perceived safety in their travel arrangements. This proposition is a little dicey, and I'm not going to take it at face value, so flag it for further exploration later in the video. Furthermore, the annual cost of owning a car in 2022 rose to $10,728 from $9,666 in 2021. The long-term sustainability, I think I would have used the word persistence here, of increased vehicle miles traveled and auto ownership raises concerns about traffic congestion. It is therefore vital to understand the impact of reduced transit use on the overall efficiency of the roadway system, particularly in dense urban areas. I do approach all this with some skepticism. For example, are we actually seeing increased private vehicle use and reduced transit use? There's a lot of theorizing in the Urban Mobility Report, and the authors are smart people, but I am gonna go try to find some second and third opinions. To start getting to the bottom of this, let's go back to the Streetlight Report. Metro New York's urban core, in particular, has seen both the biggest increase in VMT over the past 5 years and the biggest increase in congestion. The city's transportation system has been in the news recently due to the pause on its congestion pricing rollout, a policy that had been aimed at tackling congestion in the urban core and boosting transit funding. Newsflash, this report is a few months old and congestion pricing is due to roll out sometime between when I'm taping this right now and when the video gets uploaded. So let's delve into New York, because whatever phenomenon we're seeing where people are working remotely more but congestion is getting even worse, it really is New York that's the most extreme example of it. This article from the Regional Plan Association, an advocacy organization that, for better or worse, and mostly better in my opinion, has been integral to the tri-state region's policy and planning for the last century plus, echoes a lot of what's in the Streetlight Report, but makes the case a lot more forcefully. The fact is, New York City is experiencing the slowest travel speeds since the city started keeping track. And they even quantify it, $20 billion a year in lost time, productivity, and opportunity from sitting in traffic. I mean, it would be amazing if the city had high-capacity transportation infrastructure to bring people in and out of and around the city in an efficient way instead of people trying to drive in Manhattan in the middle of the day. Just kidding. If you dig through my back catalog, I've done videos on the bridges and tunnels that cross the Hudson and the East River, and how the ones that are dedicated to transit have orders of magnitude more person throughput capacity than vehicular bridges like the Triborough and the George Washington. But the data in the RPA article shows that the city has been going backwards since the pandemic. Just 24% of people entered Manhattan by personal vehicle in 2019, and that number was up to 29% in 2022. No less an authority than Gridlock Sam Schwartz has weighed in on this. The pandemic-driven rise of personal cars, decline in transit and carpooling, and boom in e-commerce have all contributed, as has people's reliance on rideshare apps. The effects have been especially pronounced in New York City. We're moving slower than we've probably moved since the introduction of the horse as a form of transportation. This article cites a lot of potential causes for the rise in congestion, but let's unpack it a bit. First of all, let's not call Uber and Lyft rideshare apps, or this other euphemism people like to use, transportation network companies, or TNCs. They're glorified taxis, or I just call them ride hails. It isn't rideshare. You aren't sharing a ride with anyone. They're deadheading to come pick you up, drive you to the place you want to go, and then they're deadheading to their next pickup. But there's been lots of research on the effects of ride-hail, like this one that indicates that introducing ride-hail services to a city can increase overall VMT on the network by 20 to 25%, which is pretty plausible if you consider a combination of induced vehicle trips that weren't happening before, and additional mileage from deadheading, which doesn't happen with privately owned vehicles. The all-powerful ride-hail lobby will try to tell you that their product is good for cities because it enables less vehicle ownership. But this paper found that the introduction of ride-hail led to a 9% drop in transit ridership, but only a 1% drop in private vehicle ownership. So I think it's fair to say ride-hail is part of the problem. But it's certainly not the whole picture, and I have saved what I think is the most interesting data and the most insightful research for last. On the topic of New York, the ticket situation for my January 31st event with the War on Cars is probably sold out, but check back with the link down in the description if you're still interested. And no, we are not moving the event to Madison Square Garden. So one theory about this that you'll see if you trawl like Reddit is that New Yorkers are buying more cars than ever. And it is true that there was a brief sales surge once the worst of the pandemic was over, but I think it's more accurate to say this was mostly pent-up demand from supply chain issues and related stuff early in the pandemic. If you look at American Community Survey data, car ownership in New York is flat between 2019 and 2023, or actually if you squint, it's just a hair lower. The commute mode split is a different story though. Work from home is up 9 percentage points from 2019, and almost all of that got cannibalized from transit, not from driving. So that's consistent with the data from the RPA that showed a higher proportion of people driving into Manhattan relative to transit than before the pandemic. I went and checked the National Transit Database to compare the same 2 years, and sure enough, unlinked passenger trips on the subway down from 2.7 billion in 2019 to about 2 billion in 2023. That's a 25% drop, and I would just pause here to say that in any other US city, if 25% of people stopped using transit and started getting around the city by other means, or just stayed home, it would barely even register. But in New York, where such a high proportion of trips are on transit and there's such a high proportion of car-free households, it makes a huge difference. Going back to the commute mode split numbers though, note that the percentage driving is flat. The drop in transit basically all shifted to work from home. And this raises an important point about this data. These numbers are just for work-related trips, and most of our transit systems, New York included, have networks built around traditional commute flows in and out of downtown. Well, the pandemic has disrupted all of those patterns, and we need to discuss. Because I still feel like none of what I've shown you so far really gets to the why. Why has highway travel rebounded quickly while transit use has been slow to return in most places, to the point where a lot of people are wondering if it'll ever come all the way back? So here's a report called Examining the Impact of Stress and Fear of COVID-19 on Transit Travel, and it's a joint effort between Texas A&M and the University of Puerto Rico at Mayaguez, and it really focuses on this phenomenon of transit being slow to regain ridership after the worst of the pandemic. The report explores the question of whether all of this is related to psychological factors like stress and fear of being exposed to the virus on crowded transit vehicles. What they did is actually wild. They used several different methods to try to get at this question, mostly around trying to elicit stress responses to descriptions or visualizations of situations involving transit. They measured stress using galvanic skin response, facial expression tracking, and self-reporting, and yes, there are lots of helpful exhibits in the report showing the mildly Clockwork Orange type procedures involved. An additional effort included a virtual reality experiment with skin conductance response measurements and a survey questionnaire that immersed subjects in a typical transit situation to provoke a reaction of risk related to COVID-19. By the way, the virtual reality streetscapes are probably nicer than any actual street environment in the US. But anyway, there are a ton of interesting findings in the report, but the bottom line is respondents who reported a lower use of transit during the pandemic also had higher average stress levels and higher fear of COVID-19. And I guess my question is, are those people ever going to be regular transit riders again? I'm probably on the less fearful end of the spectrum when it comes to this stuff, but there are lots of folks out there with higher risk factors and they have good reason to be stressed. But here's the research that I found most convincing for everything we're seeing. Most of this is warehoused by the State Smart Transportation Initiative, which is housed at the University of Wisconsin and is an arm of Smart Growth America. The jumping off point is this article. Workers offset their commute travel when working from home, and it cites a new UC Berkeley study that found that remote work can have an induced travel effect on non-work trips, and that people tend to make one extra trip on days they work from home, and that this is typically a new trip and not one that would have been taken another time. So I want you to kind of sit with this for a minute, because when we looked at the census data, we saw that commute mode share post-pandemic in New York had shifted from transit to work from home. But what this research is saying is that people who work from home for whatever reason replace that commute trip with a non-work trip. And as we discussed earlier, our transit networks tend to be built around commuting, so those non-work trips are more likely to be private vehicle trips, adding to congestion. I do recommend people check out the State Smart Transportation Initiative. I'm usually pretty skeptical when I see the terms smart mobility or smart cities, because it's usually a euphemism for something that's just not really very smart at all. But this is a happy exception, and they link all kinds of good academic research. Does working from home reduce CO2 emissions? An analysis of travel patterns as dictated by workplaces says workplace diversification is often reflected by longer average distances for work trips, which are often associated with more remote residential locations. I mean, one thing that did happen during the pandemic was some remote workers decided to go find cheaper housing out in, like, the Hudson Valley or whatever. Findings show that teleworkers and home-based workers trade off work trips for non-work trips, with an overall increase in CO2 emission levels. And one more. Do telecommuters make fewer trips? An analysis of telecommuting travel behavior in urban and rural communities in the USA. Contrary to conventional wisdom, telecommuters made more trips per day and traveled longer distances per day compared to non-telecommuters. The analysis revealed that while home-based work trips for primary telecommuters decreased significantly, all other trip purposes increased in number and distance, more than canceling out the decrease in home-based work trips. These findings indicate that telecommuting is likely to increase total VMT and associated negative impacts, and should inform relevant transportation policies. Counterintuitive stuff, but the lasting impacts to our cities from the COVID-19 pandemic really are staggering and complex. And as much as I'd like to give you one tidy answer to the question, why is traffic worse than ever, I think the answer is really all of the above. More ride-hail vehicles and e-commerce deliveries on our streets, yes. A segment of the population avoiding transit altogether due to virus-related trepidation, yes. People working from home replacing commuting trips with non-work related trips, maybe just out of sheer boredom. Yeah, that too. And all this is going to make it super interesting to see what happens when congestion pricing finally gets turned on this week. The drama around New York City congestion pricing has been pretty riveting to watch, even from the other side of the country. The public response to Governor Hochul's decision to reinstate it has been just fascinating, and the media coverage has been all over the map. And today's sponsor, Ground News, has really helped me get a handle on what's actually going on. Ground News is a website and app designed to make reading the news easier and more data-driven. Every day, they collect thousands of articles from all over the world and arrange them by story, complete with visual breakdowns of the reporting bias, reliability, and ownership, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. They even give you summaries to help you understand how these biases might influence framing. With the news on Governor Hochul's decision to move forward, we can see 104 different news sources reporting on it, with 27% each coming from left and right-leaning news organizations, and it's super interesting to see how differently these sources frame the story. A left-leaning source might say, New York City revives congestion pricing plan to end gridlock, which sounds like something everyone could get behind, while a right-leaning source is more like, it's a massive tool that's sparking bipartisan outrage. Is it really? The bottom line is, you can look at different perspectives and framings and come to your own conclusions. I'm someone who appreciates getting different angles on a story, not because I'm looking for quote-unquote fair and balanced coverage, but because I like to know what people on different parts of the political spectrum are talking about and how they're talking about it. So a part of the app I really like is the blind spot feed, which highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum. Like, there are certain things that just don't show up in conservative media. Like, anything related to climate. 2024 was Vancouver's wettest year so far this century. So if you're looking for a way to get outside of your own echo chamber and see what's going on in a completely different echo chamber, it's actually pretty enlightening. So ground news is a great tool for sifting through the misinformation and bias that comes at us daily, and I can't recommend it enough. In fact, they're currently offering 40% off their Vantage subscription, which is what I use for unlimited access to all their amazing features, including Blind Spot. You can only access this discount through my link, so go to ground.news/CityNerd, click on the link down the description, or use the QR code right here on the screen, and support an independent news platform that's working to make the media landscape more transparent. And that's all I've got. Thanks for joining today, and thanks as always to the patrons for your direct support, which ensures that I'll be able to keep traveling and bring you a variety of content, not only from cities around the US, but there's gonna be some international travel mixed in again soon. So be on the lookout for that. Keep the great topic suggestions coming. I'll be back with a new episode next week, and I'll see you then.